What's the quickest way to end all of your human suffering? To put a bullet in your head right now. You won't feel a thing. You'll be dead before you even notice that you pulled the trigger. That's the quickest way to end all suffering. And so obviously, that's an absurd scenario. Completely ending human suffering is
Well,
not.
you just defeated your argument. There's like a philosophical question here, and a one that we can look at data for, right? Like in terms of automation, even if we had a fully automated society like this utopia, right? That doesn't mean that people wouldn't have to do any work whatsoever, right? Like just because you don't think that it's you know enough toil or whatever doesn't mean that it's there's not work to be done. It just changes the kinds of work that we do, right? um I guess a more fundamental question to ask would be, why would we what is the utility of increasing suffering, right?
Because, well, let's look at this. Do we like people being alive or people not being alive? Like, if we take the stance that humanity itself is a good thing and it means something to be human, then we want people to keep procreating and we want people to keep living. And the direction that we're headed is there is no utility to a human being. There is no meaning to a human being. So why exist? Why procreate? Why do any of these things if the world doesn't need you? And you say, and this is something I will strongly contend, is you said that even as automation increases, people will still be needed, just not in the same capacity. I don't agree with that, because if what separates a human from a machine? Well, right now, it's things like intelligence and differentiation and the ability to do certain things that a machine can't. Well, but if you believe in artificial intelligence, pretty soon that's going to be obsolete as well. The human is not going to be able to do any of these things as well as a machine can. So what is the utility of a human being? Why do they exist? And these are things we're going to have to cope with.
So okay, so why does an AI system um why does an AI system fundamentally get rid of like the purpose of being a human? Because there's a million things in the world, right, that we suffer for, or we suffer because of, that has nothing to do with technology. A machine can't answer questions about metaphysics. It can't answer questions about philosophy, because ultimately these come down to very human expressions of emotion and thought, right? So like an existential question, like why am I put here, or like why or like what is a soul, or what is consciousness? A machine can't answer these questions, right?
Not yet. I mean, if you truly believe that there's going to be artificial intelligent robots that are on par with human beings, they're going to be able, by definition, to philosophize the same way that a human can.
Well,
And
an AI would only be able to philosophize as insofar as we're able to program them to philosophize, or to like pontificate, or to think about things, right? So if we're going to like talk about something that is like unable to feel a human experience, a la an AI, right? Because it's fundamentally not a human, right? Then how is that going to solve these like existential problems that people have grappled with for as long as humans have existed?
well, I'll answer with another question. Do you believe that there's anything to human existence and to the human mind that goes beyond just a collection of neurons and electrical connections going on in the brain?
I think that it is a question that is fundamentally unanswerable. That we can only ever know after we die, and unfortunately, we can't bring people back from the dead, right? So there's like no way to know. And even if we were able to like resurrect a corpse, right, we wouldn't be able to know whether there was like a soul that left that body and that same soul re-entered the body, or if it is just a bunch of electrons that a different soul like manifests itself in, right? So fundamentally, these are unanswerable questions until you're dead.
Well, and unless you answer that question with a definitive yes, then you have to default to the belief that one day artificial intelligence will be equal and surpass humans.
Well, I think that an AI might be able to like uh, equal human intelligence or even like surpass human intelligence, given the fact that they can like compute faster or something like that. But that doesn't mean that just because it has the ability to compute faster or something like that doesn't mean that it can answer these questions. There's
So
no reason
then,
that I would have to bite the bullet that an AI would be able to solve these questions like definitively whatsoever.
so then we'll take the opposite approach and say then you have to admit that there is something to a human being, something to us that is, you could call it equivalent to a soul, something that is not purely physical, not purely material, that creates a human. If there
Well,
is something,
but I've already answered that, right? I said fundamentally these are questions that there's no possible way for us to know. Like even if an AI was to come out and say, like unless you think that an AI would be able to like prove the existence of God or like what a consciousness is, or if the consciousness exists outside, like an id and an ego, right? Which even then I would question how an AI would be able to solve those things or prove those things, right? Like even if they were able to do that, how do we know that they are correct? Because there's no way for us to possibly know that until we die.
well, whether you can or cannot know, it doesn't change the fact that one of those statements has to be true. Either the human existence is purely material or it's purely not. And in either case, there's going to be severe consequences to this. In both cases,
Hmm.
technology is going to be highly destructive.
Well,
Uh,
why?
well, let's look at it. So, if there is nothing to a human being other than the purely material, then we are going to create robots that equal and then finally surpass humans and make us obsolete. There's no reason for us to be alive. There's no reason for us to, there's no utility to us. We just don't have any use to the world.
Well,
And
so this is what I'm trying to understand is why is it that you believe that humans are unable to find uh, any like fundamental like meaning in their existence outside of suffering, right? Because even if I was to grant you that we are going to create this AI, I'm so sorry, whose dog is whining? It's making
that's
me
mine.
so
I'm sorry.
fucking depressed. It's hurting my soul. All right, so um you're muted, Papa
Sondsol, I
Bear.
just want
Yeah,
to
Ozzy,
confirm, bro. You
maybe just
confirm you
mute
have a
yourself in
soul.
between.
Yeah, so the like why do you like so every time we've created a new technology, right, that fundamentally changes the way that humans operate, right? Like we've created computers. This fundamentally changes the way that we operate in society and how we organize society, right? We created all sorts of things that make it to where we can produce more food so that less people are starving to death, right? But we've always like found this like default state of being, right, that is now the default, and we find other things to focus on, right? We didn't at a certain point the suffering that we had of was keeping us from thinking about the kind of philosophical questions that came after we solved those problems of suffering, right? So for example, like we created medicine, right? And that made it to where we no longer had to like worry about like smallpox. People lived longer, and now we have to think about like, well, like at what point does like life begin? When does life end? Like when does someone have more moral worth? When we're talking about abortion and shit like that, right? There's a million different questions that come out of like the increased lifespan of humans, and the like at what point a life begins and shit like that. So can you explain to me why we wouldn't just find a new baseline that we could then um, find new suffering in?
So this is what I will say. You need to take this like any stance. I guess philosophically has to be taken to its logical conclusion. If we look at technology, what we consider good about technology is the fact that it reduces human suffering. And well, then we have to ask, uh, is reducing human suffering a good thing? And if you take that to the logical conclusion, then the ideal amount of human suffering would be zero. In which case, what's the quickest way to end all of your human suffering? To put a bullet in your head right now. You won't feel a thing. You'll be dead before you even notice that you pulled the trigger. That's the quickest way to end all suffering. And so obviously, that's an absurd scenario. So completely ending human suffering is
Well,
not.
you just defeated your argument by saying that the only way to end suffering, which you're saying is a good thing, right? The only way to end suffering is to die, right? So obviously, we're always going to find some amount of suffering, no matter how much exponential technology we invent, right? There's always going to be some level of suffering, which you're saying here is a good thing, right? So why would we stop the technology, which would create less suffering on stuff that we don't need to think about anymore, right?
Because I think that the scale of the suffering definitely does make a difference. I mean,
But
if
we've not
we're
changed the scale of suffering. We've only shifted where the suffering is coming from.
so we can definitely, I think, through
Mm.
technology, find a way to totally reduce human suffering to zero. Ultimately, if we think, I mean, if we think on a very large scale, in 10 million years, technology will have gotten us to the point where we can just constantly flood our brains with dopamine and not be suffering for a single waking moment of our existence. Is
So
that what we consider good?
well, we can look at a situation like that, right? And we can say, okay, so if we're like getting to the point where humans are just flooding their minds with dopamine, if those people in 10 million years believe that that's like what they want to do, then I think that there's nothing that we can do at this point in human society to change that, right? Uh, in order for us to find what you think is the perfect amount of suffering, we would have to like get to the point where like humans no longer find any utility, right, in the amount of technology we have. And then at that point they would have to like either choose to live that life or to or to live it, right?
I don't quite follow.
So
Could you-
why do you think that you should be able to choose for people in the future what amount of suffering is the perfect amount? Why do you think that you've solved that question by saying that the technology of the 15th century is the optimal amount of suffering, right? How do you know that you've solved this?
because I'm not going to commit and say that this is the optimal amount of suffering, but I can very much definitively say what is not enough. And I think that zero is not enough. And
Well,
if our
sure.
current trajectory is taking us on a path to zero, we need to look at our trajectory and say, maybe let's change course. And I don't think many people are really willing to evaluate that and look at the problem.